In a room where egos once clashed, something unexpected happened. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath caught between disbelief and awe. The walls of the auditorium, once echoing with argument, tension, and rivalry, now carried only the rhythm of applause. Under the harsh white lights, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, her expression unreadable, her steps deliberate. Cameras turned, flashes burst, and for a single suspended moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Zohran Mamdani stood at the podium, still absorbing the enormity of what had just unfolded. The crowd's roar was fading into a stunned silence. Then, over the hum of murmurs, her voice cut through, steady, resolute, almost tender. "Zohran," she said, "today history belongs to you." A ripple moved through the audience. Some leaned forward in disbelief. Others reached instinctively for their phones. Even her critics didn't see this coming. Jasmine Crockett, the fierce debater, the unapologetic voice of defiance, had just done what no one expected. She congratulated the man who redefined leadership. This wasn't a routine courtesy. It was a declaration, a public surrender of ego to integrity. In that handshake, the old guard and the new found a bridge. The clapping grew louder, echoing off marble walls like the sound of something greater being born. Mamdani's smile was small but meaningful. His eyes glistened with both exhaustion and pride. Behind him, the campaign banners seemed to shimmer under the light, as though even fabric recognized the weight of the moment. Somewhere in the front row, a young volunteer wept quietly, whispering, "He did it. We did it." Outside the venue, the city buzzed without knowing what had just occurred inside, a scene that would soon dominate every headline, every feed, every conversation. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about dignity, recognition, and a long overdue passing of the torch. Because in that instant, two figures who once stood on opposite ends of the ideological line showed the nation something rare, grace. But this moment, this silence before the applause erupted again, was only the surface of a much deeper story. To understand why this moment mattered, we need to go back to the fight that started it all. Before the applause, there was a storm. For months, the country had watched a battle unfold, one that wasn't fought with fists or slogans, but with ideas sharp enough to divide generations. It was the old guard versus the new voices, the comfortable versus the courageous. And in that collision, America was forced to ask itself what kind of leadership it truly wanted. The backdrop was relentless. Cable news cycles spun every disagreement into spectacle, every word into weapon. Committees clashed, commentators picked sides, and through it all, two names kept rising above the noise: Jasmine Crockett and Zohran Mamdani. Both had fire in their veins, both claimed to fight for truth, but their methods could not have been more different. Crockett was the spark, unapologetic, relentless, the kind of truth-teller who didn't just challenge power but scorched it. Her speeches carried the fury of a generation tired of being dismissed. When she spoke, her voice cracked with conviction. She was the embodiment of confrontation, every syllable a jab at hypocrisy. She didn't just want change. She demanded it, even if it burned bridges along the way. Mamdani, on the other hand, was the still flame, the reformer who believed change didn't have to roar to be real. He spoke quietly, but his words cut deeper than shouting ever could. Where others saw chaos, he saw strategy. Where others built walls, he built coalitions. His patience was often mistaken for weakness, until people began realizing that behind his calm was an unshakable will. Their paths crossed not by design, but by destiny. In hearings, in interviews, in public exchanges that drew millions of views, they stood opposite each other like two forces of nature. Crockett's words struck like thunder. Mamdani's replies rolled in like steady rain, unmoved, cleansing, impossible to ignore. The nation was split between them, those who craved the fire and those who believed in the flame. But beneath the noise, something larger was forming. The establishment, the faceless machine of donors, pundits, and power brokers, watched nervously. Both of these figures threatened the same thing: control. The system had long thrived on division, on keeping reformers isolated, but this time division was cracking from within. Because when the debates turned personal, When the lines blurred between conviction and ambition, the question shifted. It was no longer who would win the argument, but what was being fought for. Representation wasn't a slogan anymore. It was a mirror being held up to the country's soul. Jasmine Crockett fought for the unheard. Zohran Mamdani fought for the unseen. Both carried the same weight, though neither would admit it yet. There were nights when analysts mocked them both, claiming they were chasing impossible dreams. There were op-eds calling them too emotional, too idealistic, too radical. Yet while the media obsessed over their rivalry, something invisible was happening. Their audiences, young, diverse, hopeful, were beginning to overlap. They watched both leaders not as opponents, but as proof that conviction still existed. Every speech, every clash, every moment of tension pulled the country further into the story, until even those who hated politics found themselves watching, waiting, wondering. Nobody could have guessed that two forces once divided by ideology would soon unite in purpose. But before that unity came, the storm had to reach its peak. Because before the applause, there had to be conflict. Before the handshake, there had to be a fight. And what came next? The twist that followed would leave even their rivals stunned. The real villain was never a person. It was the system, old, polished, and suffocatingly familiar. A structure built to protect itself, powered by money, tradition, and the illusion of inevitability. The faces on television smiled as they mocked the idea of reform, as if change itself was naive. They laughed in dark studios lit by the glow of their teleprompters, mistaking cynicism for wisdom. "He's passionate," one pundit smirked, "but politics isn't built for dreamers." The panel chuckled. The chyron beneath them read, "Can Mamdani even compete?" Corporate politics had its own gravity, pulling everything toward conformity. Candidates were measured not by conviction, but by how comfortably they fit into the mold. How many donors they could charm, how many hands they could shake at fundraisers where sincerity went to die. And in that world, Zohran Mamdani was an anomaly, an immigrant son with a campaign built on community, not capital. Every step forward seemed to invite another obstacle. When he spoke about housing justice, they called him unrealistic. When he spoke about healthcare, they called him radical. And when he spoke about unity, they dismissed him as naive. The same anchors who praised fresh energy in politics rolled their eyes the moment it threatened the status quo. Newspapers joined in. Headlines dripped with quiet condescension. Local idealist pushes progressive fantasy. Mamdani's vision? Hope or hype? Editorial boards framed him as the dreamer who didn't understand how real politics worked. What they really meant was, he wasn't theirs to control. But outside the marble halls and studio lights, another story was being written. In cramped apartments, on street corners, in church basements and mosques, young volunteers worked until midnight. They weren't paid consultants or seasoned operatives. They were teachers, nurses, delivery workers, students, people who saw their own struggles reflected in his words. They printed flyers by hand, canvassed in the cold, and talked to neighbors who hadn't voted in years. To the establishment, it looked like chaos. To those inside it, it felt like rebirth. The political class scoffed at the movement's lack of structure. But what they didn't understand was that structure wasn't what this campaign was missing. It was what it was replacing. Hierarchies gave way to humanity. Decisions weren't made in boardrooms but in living rooms. Power didn't trickle down. It rose from the streets. The networks, of course, saw none of this. They saw a man who refused to play by their script. In their dimly lit studios, the anchors rehearsed their disbelief. One segment host smirked as the camera zoomed in. "He's trending again. That's cute. Twitter love doesn't win elections." Another replied with a laugh, "He'll learn." They always do. But something was happening beneath their radar. Something too organic, too alive to fit into polling models. People weren't just supporting a candidate. They were reclaiming their voice. Each clip they dismissed online became a spark. Each insult became oxygen. The walls of cynicism began to crack, not with outrage, but with belief. And belief, once it takes hold, is impossible to stop. Still, the system fought back. Lobbyists whispered. Editorial boards shifted coverage. Donor networks closed ranks. The machine worked overtime to remind America who was serious and who was sentimental. But while the establishment operated on money, Mamdani's movement operated on meaning, and meaning spreads faster. There were nights when the volunteers gathered around a single screen, watching pundits ridicule the campaign. They didn't flinch. They smiled, because every word of mockery meant the same thing. They're afraid of us now. And they were right. For years, politics had been a stage play, rehearsed, predictable, built to entertain rather than inspire. But this time, the audience was rewriting the script. The old actors were losing their lines. Every chant, every door knock, every conversation was a quiet rebellion against the cynicism that had defined a generation. In back rooms where consultants once dictated outcomes, panic began to creep in. How do you fight someone who doesn't depend on your permission? How do you silence a voice that doesn't speak for itself, but for thousands who've been ignored? You can't, because the truth about systems is that they aren't toppled by explosions. They crumble from within, one belief at a time, one moment of courage after another. And as the establishment laughed, the cracks widened quietly. Irreversibly, the machine didn't know it yet, but its time was running out, because every system eventually meets its challenger. And his name was Zohran Mamdani. Zohran Mamdani didn't begin his story in the marble halls of power. His story began in the narrow streets of Queens, a neighborhood stitched together by accents, aromas, and ambition. The son of Ugandan Indian immigrants, he grew up surrounded by stories of exile and resilience. His parents carried the memory of displacement like a scar that never quite faded. And from them, Zohran learned early that identity wasn't something to hide. It was something to honor. He watched his mother balance 2 jobs while helping neighbors fill out rent forms. He watched his father quietly tutor children who couldn't afford after-school programs. Service wasn't a choice in his family. It was the air they breathed. But Zohran also saw the other side of the immigrant dream. The fatigue, the invisibility, the slow erosion of hope in a system that rarely looked down to notice who was holding it up. In school, he was never the loudest, never the one seeking the spotlight. Yet when classmates argued about injustice, he was the one who listened, absorbed, and then asked the question that silenced the room. If we all see the problem, why aren't we fixing it? That question would become the engine of his life. His early activism wasn't glamorous. There were no cameras, no slogans, just late nights in community centers with flickering lights and handwritten posters. He organized tenants facing eviction, marched with delivery workers demanding fair pay, and sat in living rooms where undocumented families spoke about fear in whispers. He didn't lead from above, he walked among them. When a reporter once asked why he chose politics, he replied simply, "Because I got tired of asking for permission to care." But the path wasn't smooth. When he first ran for local office, the establishment laughed. His campaign had no big donors, no consultants, no endorsements. The first rally he held drew only 11 people, 2 of whom left before he finished speaking. That night, sitting in an empty office surrounded by half-torn posters and cold pizza boxes, he stared at the city lights and wondered if sincerity could ever win against spectacle. It was his mother who called that night. "You don't stop when the room is empty," she said. "You keep speaking until it's full." He never forgot it, so he did what he always did. He showed up. Day after day, block after block, he showed up. Rain or shine, crowded or alone, he spoke with the same calm conviction. He didn't promise miracles. He promised presence. Slowly, people began to notice. Not because he was loud, but because he listened. Not because he was flawless, but because he was real. While others built platforms, he built trust. He refused to insult his opponents even when attacked. When questioned about corruption scandals, he didn't grandstand. He spoke about accountability like it was sacred. He talked about leadership as a collective act, a shared burden rather than a solo performance. And the more he spoke, the more people realized that his quietness wasn't shyness. It was strength, the kind that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off. Contrast that with the politics surrounding him. Politicians who measured success in applause, who weaponized outrage, who chased headlines instead of healing. Their words were loud but hollow. Zohran's were soft but heavy. Where others demanded loyalty, he offered empathy. Where others saw voters, he saw neighbors. As his movement grew, so did the sacrifices. There were nights when he skipped meals to stretch campaign funds, days when exhaustion blurred his vision. He sold his car to cover printing costs. He took rejection after rejection from organizations that claimed to champion fresh voices, but never meant it. Yet he never complained. Every setback became a lesson, every insult a kind of fuel. His friends called him the calm in the chaos. Even in defeat, he carried a kind of stillness that unsettled his detractors. He never shouted back, because he understood that outrage may win moments, but patience wins movements. And it wasn't just patience. It was faith, not the blind kind, but the kind born from community. He believed that leadership wasn't about standing in front of people, but standing with them. That belief turned supporters into believers, and believers into organizers. Soon his campaign wasn't about one man running for office. It was about thousands running toward a better version of their country. He became the candidate who didn't need to buy airtime because his words traveled through people's hearts. Each door he knocked on was another promise, not of power, but of partnership. And though the establishment still sneered, though pundits still dismissed him as too idealistic, something irreversible was happening. People were beginning to see themselves in his story. Because Zohran Mamdani wasn't selling a dream. He was reflecting it. As election day neared, the city seemed to hold its breath. The pundits called him an underdog. His supporters called him inevitable. He didn't have a war chest. He didn't have elite endorsements. But what he did have, the one thing no machine could fabricate, was trust. And soon that trust would ignite something historic. The auditorium buzzed long before the debate began. Cameras were being adjusted, microphones tested, and every seat was filled. It wasn't just another political event. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. On one side stood Jasmine Crockett, fiery and unflinching, known for her sharp wit and unapologetic defense of truth. On the other, Zohran Mamdani, composed and deliberate, known for his quiet conviction and almost unsettling calm. When they finally walked onto the stage, the contrast was immediate. Jasmine carried an energy that filled the room. Her eyes sharp, her movements precise. Zohran, meanwhile, looked as though he had already made peace with whatever the outcome would be. Steady, still, unreadable. Between them lay more than a stage. It was the ideological divide of a nation. Passion versus patience, conviction versus composure. The moderator introduced the first question, and from the very first exchange, sparks flew. Jasmine's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "People are tired of promises," she declared. "They want results, real ones. You can't reform a system that's been built to exploit. You have to confront it." The crowd erupted. Cheers mixed with applause. Phones rose to capture the moment. Zohran waited for the noise to settle, hands clasped lightly in front of him. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured. Not defensive, not dismissive, but deeply intentional. "I agree," he began softly. "But confrontation without conversation only builds walls. And I think our people deserve bridges." A murmur rippled through the audience, quieter, more thoughtful. From then on, the debate became something electric. Jasmine's sentences came like lightning, bright, rapid, impossible to ignore. Zohran's came like thunder, delayed but resonant, rolling through the room long after he stopped speaking. At one point, Jasmine challenged him directly. "You talk about trust," she said, leaning forward. "But trust doesn't feed families. Trust doesn't pay rent. People don't need patience. They need action." Zohran looked at her, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a calm that seemed almost audacious, he replied, "Action without trust is just noise. And I'd rather build something that lasts than something that trends." The silence that followed was powerful, not because of the words themselves, but because everyone could feel it. Two visions for change colliding, neither entirely wrong. As the debate progressed, interruptions came, from the crowd, from passion, from truth itself struggling to be heard. There were moments when voices overlapped, when applause drowned out arguments, when the tension was so thick it almost crackled. Yet beneath it all was a strange rhythm, a respect slowly forming note by note. Between questions their eyes would meet, not with animosity, but with recognition. Each saw in the other something familiar. Conviction, sacrifice, the unbearable weight of wanting to make things better. It wasn't a clash of egos. It was a collision of purpose. As the debate neared its climax, the moderator asked the question that would define the night. What does leadership mean to you? Jasmine answered first. Her tone softened, but her fire remained. Leadership, she said, is standing up when it's hardest. It's saying what people are afraid to hear. It's refusing to bend even when you're alone. The crowd roared again. She was the embodiment of defiance. Bold, brave, unyielding. Then came Zohran's turn. He didn't move. Didn't raise his voice. Just looked out into the audience and said, "Leadership is knowing when to speak and when to listen. It's not about being right. It's about doing right even when no one is watching." A hush swept the room. Even Jasmine, who moments earlier had been ready for another round, found herself still. Their words, though different in rhythm, were moving toward the same melody. By the time the closing statements arrived, the atmosphere had shifted. The debate had started as a battlefield, but it was ending as something else, an exchange between two people who had found common ground in their differences. When the moderator thanked them, both stood and shook hands. The cameras flashed, and in that brief handshake, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement that neither could have moved hearts alone, but together they had moved minds. And as the lights dimmed and the crowd's cheers echoed into the night, one thing became clear. This wasn't just the peak of tension. It was the beginning of understanding. But when the dust settled, it wasn't anger that defined what came next. It was respect. The room was already electric before Zohran Mamdani took the stage. But when he stepped up to the microphone, something shifted. The clatter of cameras slowed. Conversations faded into quiet anticipation. Even those who had come ready to criticize leaned forward without realizing it. Everyone could sense it. The air had changed. Behind him, the banner still read "New York Forward," though tonight it felt like something larger was beginning, something beyond a city, beyond a campaign. The moment wasn't about winning anymore. It was about what came next. Zohran adjusted the mic. The first few words caught in his throat, not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of everything behind them. The nights without sleep, the doors slammed, the headlines that dismissed him as too idealistic, too inexperienced, too foreign. He took a breath. Then he began. "I stand here," he said softly, "not as someone who beat the odds, but as proof that the odds can be changed." A murmur rippled through the audience. Phones rose into the air. Somewhere near the front, a journalist stopped typing. "For months," he continued, "we were told to wait our turn. We were told that change is slow, that systems are fixed, that our voices don't reach far enough. But tonight," he paused, letting the silence do the work, "tonight proves that they were wrong." The crowd erupted, but Zohran lifted his hand, asking for calm. His tone sharpened but never lost its warmth. "Because this victory isn't mine. It belongs to the teachers who stayed late and still couldn't afford rent, to the cab drivers who drive through the night and still can't pay for health care, to the immigrants who were told to blend in when all they wanted was to belong." Applause rolled through the hall, steady and thunderous. Jasmine Crockett, standing off to the side, watched intently. Her arms were crossed, but her face softened. She had seen countless speeches before, fiery, passionate, forgettable. But this was different. Zohran's voice rose again. "For too long, leadership has been a privilege. A closed room where deals are made, where the people outside the door are told to wait. But leadership is not a privilege, it's a promise. And that promise starts with listening." You could hear people whispering in the crowd. "He's right. He's actually saying it." Then came the moment, the one that would replay across social media for days, weeks, maybe years. He leaned forward slightly, the light catching his face just right. His voice suddenly quiet enough that the microphones strained to catch it. "They said I wasn't ready. That I didn't play the game. That I didn't know how the system worked. And they were right. I didn't come here to learn their system. I came here to change it." The crowd froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, like a spark to gasoline, the entire room erupted. Cheers, applause, people on their feet. The kind of roar that shakes the walls and drowns out thought. Jasmine exhaled slowly, almost smiling. Even she couldn't help it. The pundits in the back, The ones who had mocked his campaign from polished studio chairs exchanged glances. Some looked down. Others forced a grin, as if to disguise the sting of being wrong. And yet Zohran wasn't done. "This isn't about left or right," he said, voice cutting through the noise. "It's about right and wrong. About whether we build a future where power serves people, or people serve power. That's the choice before us." Every word landed like a strike against cynicism itself. On the large screens behind him, cameras caught tears, smiles, disbelief. The kind of raw emotion that politics rarely allows. And I want to say this, to the young organizers who were told they'd never be heard, to the volunteers who gave up their weekends, to every person who believed that empathy still belongs in politics. You weren't wasting your time. You were building history. From the corner, a chant began, hesitant at first, then louder, spreading across the hall. "Zohran. Zohran, Zohran." Even as the sound swelled, he didn't bask in it. He simply nodded, eyes glistening, humbled rather than inflated. That humility, that refusal to posture, made the moment even more powerful. Outside, the ripple effect had already begun. Within minutes, hashtags exploded across Twitter and Instagram. Clips of his words. "I didn't come here to learn their system. I came here to change it." Spread like wildfire. Pundits scrambled to rewrite their takes. The same commentators who had laughed at his candidacy were now calling it transformational, once in a generation, the speech that redefined modern leadership. Inside the hall, Jasmine Crockett finally stepped forward. When Zohran noticed her approaching, the crowd quieted. The cameras zoomed in. She extended her hand again, just like before. But this time it wasn't ceremony. It was solidarity. "I underestimated you," she said simply. Zohran smiled, replying softly, "No, you challenged me." That's how progress begins. The audience applauded again, not in frenzy this time, but with something deeper. Respect, understanding, hope, and then silence, not of shock, but of realization. The kind of silence that only truth can create. The kind that reminds everyone watching that something irreversible has just happened. For once, the analysts, the lobbyists, the polished voices of the establishment, they had nothing to say. Their scripts didn't fit this story. Their cynicism had met its limit. You could almost see it in their faces. The dawning awareness that they weren't just witnessing a speech. They were witnessing a shift. Across living rooms and newsrooms, people replayed that moment. The breath before the applause, the honesty before the spin. It felt like clarity after years of fog. As the crowd began to disperse, Zohran stayed on stage a moment longer, looking out over the people who had believed when it made no sense to. His hand rested on the podium, his eyes searching the crowd, as if memorizing every face that made this night real. And then, softly, he said the words that would close the night. Words that felt like a promise carved into history itself. This isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of everyone. The room erupted once more, a standing ovation that went on until it blurred into applause, laughter, and tears. Outside, the streets filled with chants, phones lit up, strangers embraced. What had started as a campaign had become a movement. What had begun as one man's fight had turned into a collective awakening. But as the cameras faded to black, one question remained, whispered by supporters, feared by critics, and felt by everyone watching from afar. If this was just the beginning, what comes next? But what happened next? No one could have predicted. It began as a spark, a few clips uploaded by volunteers still trembling from adrenaline. Within minutes, the night's defining line was everywhere. "I didn't come here to learn their system. I came here to change it." Those 11 words were looping across timelines, stitched into edits, blasted in car radios, turned into TikToks where teenagers lip-synced to every syllable like a national anthem. They replayed it. They remixed it. They remembered it. By sunrise, hashtags flooded every platform. New Era sat at #1 in the US. Leadership Reborn trailed close behind, and Mamdani Moment reached across continents. On Instagram, artists illustrated the speech in comic book panels. Zohran standing beneath blinding stage lights, mic in hand, a crowd drawn in shades of blue and gold behind him. On TikTok, creators spliced his words with footage of marches, classrooms, and city skylines, captioned simply, "This is what leadership looks like." Cable news scrambled to catch up. Anchors spoke with the urgency of people who knew they were late to the story. "This isn't just a campaign win," one commentator said on air. "It's a cultural event." Another, previously skeptical pundit, stared down at his notes and admitted almost grudgingly, maybe politics needed this kind of reset. Meanwhile, the internet had already declared its verdict. Fan pages emerged overnight. Twitter users crafted poetic threads about the night cynicism lost. YouTubers dissected his body language frame by frame. "See this?" One viral analysis said, zooming in on Zohran's pause before the mic drop line. That's the moment truth broke through performance. Even the memes carried reverence. One showed the old system as a crumbling statue. Another had Zohran's face edited onto a movie poster titled The Reformer. Someone tweeted, "I was just scrolling and now I'm crying. How did politics become this again?" In the Bronx, a teacher projected the speech on a classroom screen. In California, a group of high school students organized an impromptu discussion titled Change versus Tradition. In Nairobi, a local paper printed the quote on its front page beside a headline that read, "The American Dream Redefined." The ripple effects were global. Commentators in London, Toronto, and Mumbai, as the cameras fade, remember this: the new era has begun and history is already watching.